this freight train didn't kill itself. Before we get into that, though, I'm not going to mention a premium hangout number 30, where it was one of
It
yours.
was myself and Carl where we discussed unspecified medical treatment.
You discussed something that we can't talk about on YouTube, so I'm not going to tell you about that. And if you want to watch that thing that didn't happen, then you can go to the Lotus Eaters, and it's only £5 a month. Sign up, and you'll have a really interesting conversation about something we can't even talk about here. So something that I am still allowed to talk about, however, is East Palestine. I think it's written Palestine, but they pronounce it Palestine. So
Yeah, the wrong one blew up.
yeah. Palestine is a lovely little American town. It's got about 4,500 residents, and it's a nice little community. It's split in half by this rail track, and to the north you've got most of the residential, and you've got the college, the high school, and to the south you've got most of the light industrial, and you've got the commercial. It basically looks like the first 15 minutes of any SimCity game. And it's located on the eastern side of America. And if you were to draw a triangle with 400-mile wide lines on it, you'd have like New York and Washington and East Palestine. So that's roughly where it is. In fact, it's about 20 minutes down the road from a place called Salem, which of course you all know from your history, which is part of America's witches and wizards minority community. Now, speaking of Salem, I'm going to show you a video from there. Here it is, of a train going through Salem about 20 minutes down the track. And this was filmed and 8 p.m. on the 3rd of February. This is a CCTV camera picking up a train heading towards East Palestine, and it's on fire, which isn't particularly good.
I thought there was just a spark shooting off the wheels. Is that
No, I think
flames?
the underside of it is on fire at this point.
Oh my god! Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that's not good. Whatever that is, it's going badly. Anyway, so that trundles on down the track, and it derails just past the town centre, and this is just before the border with Pennsylvania. So two states are sort of heavily affected by this.
That's quite interesting as well, that it's going into Pennsylvania, because Harry and I, for our next Comics Corner this week, will be discussing the movie Unbreakable. And
right.
that centers around a train derailment caused by a terrorist. And it just turns out that America's infrastructure is so terrible that you didn't need to be a supervillain. You could have just waited.
Yes. Now, apparently, train derailments are fairly common in the US. There's been 12 proper derailments so far this year. And if you count all classifications of derailments, apparently they get up to like 1,000 a year, but that includes sort of minor ones as well. So it is a fairly common thing. Now, this was 3 engines pulling 150 cars, so it's an absolutely enormous load. So when one of them comes off, you've got all that inertia. Whatever it is, millions of tons of inertia going forward. It's in fact, I've got this article here where we've got some images of the side, and as you can see, they come off, and then there's the aftermath with the smoke plume, and I'll be getting into that, and the fireballs and all the rest of it. But there's one where they all sort of concertinas up behind each other because you all this sort of inertia going on. Now, the problem is it was carrying, out of these 150 cars, 20 of them was hazardous material, and apparently it was including 2.5 million gallons of vinyl chloride. Now, vinyl chloride is the VC in PVC, so pipes, kitchenware. Well, I mean, we're surrounded by PVC now. I mean, it's everywhere. It's in everything.
It's in the bloody drinking water, placentas of babies. It's not good.
Yeah, I mean, not supposed to be, but in most cases. But the PVC is the polymerized form, which is safe, and well, I mean, I wouldn't suggest drinking it, but
No.
But on the whole, you're surrounded by PVC, the polymerized form, and it's perfectly fine. But the unpolymerized form, the natural form, now that is pretty bad stuff. In fact, it's quite carcinogenic. If you are exposed to 1 part per million in the air, so if you're given volume of air, if just 1 part out of a million of that is vinyl chloride, that is enough to give very aggressive cancers that will kill you in months. And the surrounding area of this was registering apparently 50 parts per million, so that was basically bad. And the story goes like this: is the train company and the people who know about this sort of stuff, presumably the EPA or whoever it was, and the local governor, they looked at this situation and said, well, look, we got a load of very explosive vinyl chloride, which is going to release all of this hugely carcinogenic cloud of whatever into the area, and do this bad thing. So they decided that the lesser of two evils was to set it on fire, which would apparently make a somewhat less toxic but much larger cloud of smoke, and release that out into the atmosphere. That's one framing. The other framing is that it was basically too expensive to clear up, and they wanted to get the line open faster, and therefore they burnt it to achieve that. So whichever of those framings you want, but I can well imagine that it was a lesser of two evil calculation. Now, the problem is that when you burn vinyl chloride, apparently the combustion product is hydrogen chloride, right? So you've got a big cloud of hydrogen chloride. Now, when that reacts with water, so rain, you get hydrogen chloride reacts to create hydrochloric acid and phosphine. Now, you might well be asking, well, what is hydrochloric acid? Now, I learnt all of my chemistry by watching Breaking Bad, and so that's how I'm going to explain it to you. So, first of all, this is hydrochloric acid.
I never use this stuff. Are you sure it'll do the job?
Trust us.
You should have chosen Jeffrey Dahmer for LGBT representation.
I should have done, shouldn't I? So anyway, that's hydrochloric acid, so that's a bad thing. And secondly, what is phosphine? Here we go.
Move it, Holmes. You got all day?
Right, so I'm sure we can all agree that both of these molecules are bad news. You don't really want those, and that is apparently now what is raining down across America. Now, I don't know how bad this is, but I think we can all agree it is at least some kind of very bad. You've got this sort of big death cloud raining acid and possibly phosphine gas into the atmosphere.
I have been reliably informed that it's nowhere near as lethal as it could have been if they had not done the controlled burn.
Right.
And that it has sort of 48-hour window, and the concentration is not meant to be bad enough with the acid rain to properly affect human beings. But I have also seen the contamination the water supply has led to some dead fish, and the speculation that there are chicken populations that have keeled over in the surrounding area because they've inhaled something not very nice. And even then as well, it took quite a while for something like the Gulf War burn pits, or the 9/11 debris, or even something like asbestos to come out and say, this is carcinogenic, people have been inhaling it in and it has long-lasting effects. So I wouldn't be surprised if X amount of years down the road, you get YouTube ads saying, were you affected by the Ohio train spill? Make a health claim here because you might be entitled to compensation.
So there is a lot of discussion about how bad this bad thing is. I'm going to show you a Substack from a chap called Adam Geithner, who's a chemist who did some fairly good work over the COVID period, and he was ahead of the curve on a lot of things. I don't know if he's right about this, but he's definitely at the more alarmist end of this. So his paragraph, which I'm going to read to you. The thick, dark clouds composed of hydrochloric acid and phosphine. You'll find similar conditions on the surface of Venus. Cars driving through the affected area have been reportedly showing signs of corrosion, and people outdoors have reported coughing fits and watering eyes, breathing difficulties and neurological effects. Everybody in the path of the cloud or exposed to the contaminated groundwater is very highly likely to suffer aggressive cancers over the coming months. Wildlife and livestock has been dying en masse within a 200-mile radius thus far, and rivers and streams are full of dead fish. So he's probably at the slightly more alarmist end of this whole conversation, and on the other end you've got the public health officials, the government agencies, and the train company, and they're going around saying everything is perfectly fine, don't worry about it at all. So the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, I would imagine. Now, that brings me to the first interesting aspect of this story, because I mean, accidents happen. This was clearly a bit of a blunder. But the first interesting thing for me about this was the lack of press coverage. So this happened about 3 weeks ago now. And it was all over Twitter, and I sort of did think about covering it at the time, but we had sort of aliens and pipelines blowing up, so I sort of bumped it for that in the end. But this was sort of very heavily covered at first, and the mainstream media did not cover it at all. Now, it's fairly obvious why they didn't cover it. It's because there is a Democrat in the office of the president at the moment. This is a bad thing. You don't cover bad things when the president is a Democrat. It's basically as simple as that. Especially because fairly early on, people discovered tweets like this one, which we've got coming up. Yeah, so this is a tweet from Biden, basically saying that he's going to lessen the controls on rail companies and make it harder for them to strike and protest for better conditions and safety and all the rest of it. So you can understand why the media didn't feel that this was worth covering. And on the other hand, you've got this Adam Gart in a chat who's basically saying that everybody to the east of the Mississippi River needs to be evacuated, and he just says, leave while you still can. Now, I think that it's possibly a bit over the top, suggesting that 250 million people need to evacuate for fear of cancer. Yeah. I mean, especially because at least 200 million of them are vaccinated. So, I mean, liver cancer can get in bloody line as far as I'm concerned. So, is this the new Chernobyl, or is this something else? Difficult to know. And the other angle is, I mean, apart from the standard sort of left-right, blue, red, ding dong that you always get into on these things. There was also the health angle, which we can't assess, and there's the BlackRock angle. Some people have been talking about that. I've decided not to go there either, because BlackRock basically own everything, and I've got a video on Brokenomics that I'm preparing at the moment, which I'll put out soon, which goes into the BlackRock thing in much more detail. Instead, the angle that I want to come at this from is that this is a fundamental failure of a base tier level function of government. So, environmental regulation, I do believe, is a legitimate function of government. And I want to explain that idea properly. So before I do, I'm going to quickly divert to something which you might have seen at school, which is this. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I got off the internet. I did make one minor modification to make it, suitable for the modern age. But basically the idea is, I'm sure you've all seen it before because they teach it in schools all the time, is that a human has certain basic needs that must be met, and then you can go on and you can build up, at each tier. Obviously we don't have the red ones. We will cease to exist fairly quickly.
I was going to say physiological needs: food, sleep, sex, and shelter. Married men falling at the first hurdle.
Yeah. And as you go up, you get all the way up to self-actualization, which is being the best you that you can be. For example, being a host on the Lotus Eaters.
Well, that psychologically speaking, that should be far lower, because self-actualization should be the prerequisite to earning a relationship. But I think that should probably be inverted in many respects.
I hadn't thought about it like that. But anyway, so the reason I show that is just to give a bit of background to what I really wanted to show you, which is something I've created myself, which is Dan's hierarchy of government. So this is how government should be. And you start at the bottom. Now, national borders and defence. And by the way, when I say defence, I do actually mean defence. I don't mean it the way that the US Department of Defence means it, because they don't do any defence. All they do is attack and bombing. But I mean actual defence. And obviously you've got to have a national border, because what is the point of having a conversation about what a country should do if the country doesn't have borders? I mean, it's nonsensical to talk about a country if it doesn't have borders. That is a base tier level, and you need to be able to defend it. So that's the first function of government. Then I've got life, liberty, and happiness. I don't know why I put happiness on there, to be fair. That's not really what I meant. But for
protection of property. So you put property rights on one above. So
yeah, but life and liberty, certainly. You don't want somebody to randomly just murder you or lock you in your basement, Joseph Fritzl style. So that, I think, securing people's life and liberty, that is a decent function of government, which would be something like some form of court system, maybe even police, although that could be done privately. The third tier, now that's important, that is the basis of the entire economy: property rights. The legitimate function of government is to enforce contracts and to say, yes, what you own is yours. If you have that, that's basically the only thing that governments need to do in order for an economy to then happen afterwards. So that's fine. The one up from that is environmental protection. I do feel that personally, you might call me a socialist for this, but I think that this is because I'm not an anarchist, even though, to be fair, anarchy does mean absence of rulers. It doesn't mean absence of rules. So chess, for example, is an anarchy. It has rules, but it doesn't have a ruler. So,
You've got no gun in your back forcing you to sit at the table and play the game.
Yes, so I'm sympathetic to the arguments of anarchists, but I would generally describe myself as a minikivist instead, somebody who favours a very small state. I don't know if you remember, but Steve Hilton, when he was involved in the Tories, he was trying to push the idea that the whole of the British government should be reduced to working in Somerset House. And if it didn't fit in, it couldn't be part of the government. So that's the sort of my concept of how big government should be. But environmental protection is one of those functions.
That seems to be just, to me, as having worked in the environmental sphere, an extension of property rights. That
Basically,
seems sensible.
So it's basically saying that you can't have a factory that just dumps its toxic waste straight into the river.
Yeah, because that's
which you see all the time in India.
That's an incursion on independent bodily autonomy.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is a function of government. And then you've got infrastructure. Now, this one I'm very dubious on because potentially that could all be led to the private sector. But, roads will happen without government doing it. But you probably get a better, more comprehensive, more joined-up system if government does it. So I'm willing to go, and I know this is sounding really socialist at this point, but I'm willing to include infrastructure in the tier of government. Try not to hate me too much, but I'm willing to go that far.
I'm sceptical about their competence, but okay.
Okay, but yeah, roads and rail, in this country at least, isn't too bad.
Right. You don't have to get 6 trains a day.
Yeah, well, yes, and then we go on to the inverted pyramid above it, which is what governments spend. So what government should be doing is that lower pyramid. That's all governments should be doing, right? And what they're instead doing is, education. So I'm not desperately upset that governments are getting involved in education. It would be better if they didn't.
I am rather infuriated given the amount I've seen coming out of it.
You would get a better quality of education if it was left to the private sector.
You'd also get far less ideological indoctrination and people like the Biden administration saying that parents aren't the primary stakeholders in their children.
So I am saying that everything in the upper pyramid is wrong. It's in order of that they annoy me.
Yes, it's the least of
So, it does annoy me, but not that much, the education bit. And then you've got all the insurance provisions that government do these days. So welfare, pensions, healthcare. Again, all of that is not something they should be doing. It should be provided by charities and the public sector who would do a better job for less money, better outcomes. Everyone would be happier, all of that kind of things. We'd all be wealthier if that was done not by government. But again, it's one of the lower order things that upsets me about government. And then you start to get into the real nonsense, which especially this applies to the US's foreign wars. It's all they do is just,
How can you say that dresses the Ukraine flag?
Yeah, I didn't think of that. I just like the colour, right? And then the top of the pyramid, where the absolute nonsense happens, is how people live and how people think. Now, the point that I'm making is that the government should do that bottom bit, but they spend their entire time obsessing about the top. They put all of their money into that top inverted pyramid, and the bottom bit just is like a Swiss cheese. It doesn't get covered at all. I'm going to jump, and then I'm going to jump back. I'm going to jump ahead to the US debt clock. Now, this is a fantastic website that I don't look at enough on these segments, but you can go to this and you can see the total amount of debt that the US has racked up, and there's also versions for other countries as well. I'm going to direct your attention to the top right-hand bit, that black box. You see that box there, like total state, local federal, state, and local spending. So this is a total amount of spending that the US government is doing. 9.6 trillion. That's a year. That's what the US government spends every year. 9.6 trillion. So let's jump back to the Dan pyramid of legitimate government. So for 9.6, in fact for 1 trillion, you should have an absolutely gold-plated double plus good bottom pyramid. Yep. You should have perfectly secure borders. You should have low crime. You should have property protected. You should have good environmental protection, good infrastructure. And those are the two bits that failed here. So my angle on what's interesting for me about this train story is that the US government is spending almost 10 trillion a year, and it cannot get its absolute bread and butter, bottom bedrock bits of government. It can't get that done because it's pumping all of its effort. I talk about bloody welfare and pensions and healthcare. The US is now paying Ukrainian pensions. Yeah.
Really?
They have been.
I know they were secured by BlackRock at one point, weren't
Yeah,
they?
they have been paying they've been paying out for the Ukrainian pension system for months now.
Right.
So it's not even that they're doing that for themselves. They're doing that inverted pyramid for other countries.
So it's the global boomer entitlement complex.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, especially if it serves the select interests of a small group of
Sons
Democrats.
of former
Yes.
presidents, yeah.
So
current.
yes. So that's my take on it. That this is a fundamental failure at the most basic level. And this is not particularly a party political thing, because the establishment GOP are just as bad at not doing the. I mean, they,
Foreign wars, yeah. It's not like the 2000
well, I mean,
Republicans ever waged
they
one
love
of those.
engaging on this stuff. I mean, yeah, I quite like somebody like Ted Cruz. I mean, he seems more or less all right, but all he ever talks about is the top of that inverted pyramid.
Yeah, Rand Paul's pretty good, and
He's
that's
better,
That's
yeah.
the debt clock
Yeah.
giving him a headache. I'm sure he's subjected to watching
Yeah.
that like a scene from Clockwork Orange.
Right. So that's my angle on the train thing as to why this is nonsense and it's interesting. One final point before we go, I want to show you this. This is Netflix White Noise. I just thought I'd give it an honourable mention. So this is a Netflix movie that came out about the same time about this derailment. And what it's about this family who lived through a train derailment in their local town, which releases a massive toxic cloud of death. And this is a very new film. Like I say, it came out about the same time as the derailment. Do you want to have a guess where it was filmed?
Was it Ohio by any chance?
East Palestine.
Right, okay,
It
well.
was filmed in the same town. Many of the
Okay.
people who've been evacuated were extras in the back of this movie.
Did someone say predictive programming?
Yes, which I just thought was interesting.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as the Contemplation series, this episode on how to spot a liar. If you'd like to find out what else the Lotus Eaters are putting out, you can follow on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.